But what is going on in Canada? I'm actually so excited to talk about it. I think it's fascinating. There's not been a lot of informed discussion or really much at all in the American media. So I get to finally exploit the fact that you're Canadian with a lot of specialized insight. And I'm very interested to hear. I've been reading a lot about it, but interested to hear what your views are.
Well, due to the vaccine mandates, there have been mandates across the provinces, and it's handled very much like the United States in the sense that mandates for being able to go to your workplace, depending on your vaccination status, is handled at the provincial level because healthcare in Canada is handled at the provincial level. So there are some provinces with more stringent measures than others. However, Alberta, I would say, is probably one of the least stringent in terms of what the mandates allow for and how strictly vaccine passports are being enforced. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have provinces like British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec, which have more strict vaccine mandates and stricter enforcement of vaccine passports. Granted, as you know, Glenn, I mean, we've talked about this on the podcast before. The spirit of the law and the letter of the law aren't necessarily congruent. So even though in Ontario there are mandates that are supposed to be enforced, well, as to whether they actually are is a whole other kettle of fish. However, the trucking industry is required. Now, this is federally enforced because when you're crossing the border, any sort of health codes or health regulations are enforced at the federal level. So the federal government required truckers who are crossing the border to show proof of vaccination before they can enter the country. If they don't have proof of vaccination, they have to quarantine for 14 days. Now, the truckers have staged a mass protest, beginning a convoy from as far west as British Columbia, driving across Canada's highways, snaking a long line to the capital of the country, Ottawa, Ontario, wherein they parked themselves and engaged in mass civil disobedience and protest, which on the face of it isn't bad. The problem is the organizers of the protest, a certain former Regsitor and Yellow Vester and a certain member of the People's Party of Canada, so that's Tamara Lich and BJ Dichter. That is, Tamara Lich is a Wexit separatist, somebody who believes that the provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta should separate from the rest of Canada so that they can have pipeline access to the Pacific Ocean, as well as BJ Dichter, who is a People's Party of Canada candidate and found himself at odds with the Conservative Party of Canada because he believes that the Conservatives are too tolerant to political Islam. Well, they were the ones that started up the GoFundMe for this trucker convoy. The trucker convoy, I believe, started with a goal of somewhere, I think it was $90,000, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong, which then ballooned to a $9 million goal. They have since surpassed that goal. They were at well over $10 million before GoFundMe froze the assets. Now, the problem with that was that they said that it was for the purpose of covering the cost of food, lodging, any incidental expenses for the truckers as they engaged in this convoy. Problem is they haven't actually released any kind of budget, nothing even so far as like an expense sheet saying this is what we estimate the costs to be. These are the partners that we're working with. This is how much we need to raise in order for this convoy to work. Instead, what happened is that truckers ended up in downtown Ottawa, parking their vehicles downtown, blocking major thoroughfares, which I don't really find to be that big of a deal. I mean, protests happen all the time, just go around them. But they're also honking their horns all through the night. And if you've ever heard a truck air horn up close, it is not a pleasant thing. If you're driving past one with your vehicle windows rolled up, not so bad, especially because you're passing it on the highway. On the other hand, if they're parked on your street outside your apartment and they're going off with these horns all night, can be a bit of a problem. Then there was also the matter of desecrating public places in front of Parliament Hill, one of which was a statue to Terry Fox, who is a nationally recognized and nationally treasured figure who ran from one coast of the country to the other to raise funds for disability awareness.
What did they do to that statue?
They put up posters and they put up like the posters that they were carrying. They made Terry Fox.
Right. So they didn't
and also
they didn't permanently desecrate it or destroy it. They just
no.
used it as a vehicle for their protest.
Yeah, yeah. Imagine I don't know, like a Paul Revere statue, and somebody put like a Tea Party placard in his hands or something, right? But liberals lost their minds about that one. That that one, didn't strike me as even remotely offensive. I mean, frankly, there are enough disabled people made of flesh and blood that require help and sympathy from Canadians. There are so many that I don't think we need to exercise any pity for an inanimate statue. But there was also the matter of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, a cenotaph that's also in front of the Parliament building. It was erected in, I believe it was 2000, the year 2000, by the Royal Canadian Legion. And it contains the remains of an unknown soldier brought over from Vimy Ridge in World War I, which was a major battle and a source of Canadian pride. It's also the site where Corporal Nathan Cirillo was killed in an attack by Joseph Zihaf Babo, who not only shot up outside of Parliament Hill, but was able to make it into the halls of Parliament, causing mass panic. People had to lock themselves into closets and cabinets to make sure that they weren't victims of gunfire. And he was actually killed by the parliamentary sergeant at arms, Ken Vickers. So, I mean, blood literally was spilled on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier because there is usually a Canadian Forces Guard that's stationed at the cenotaph. People were dancing on it. They were putting up signs and whatnot, but then people were also urinating. I have heard tell that people were defecating on the statue because they had nowhere to relieve themselves. I don't know if that's true, so I don't really want to go with that. But I do know, there were actual pictures of people having urinated on the cenotaph. That I think that was where the tide turned, and many people turned against the protesters at that point. So anyway, that's where things are.
Can I just let me interject there and just ask a question, Q, which is, I remember going way back to the protests against the Iraq War at a time when, I wasn't writing or working in politics or journalism. I was a lawyer. So I was, watching them as an observer or whatever, like everybody else. And even back then, I could recognize these tactics. Often they didn't want to cover the protests against the Iraq War because they were so large, and the media was overwhelmingly in favor of the Iraq War and therefore against these protests. And it was so obvious that one of the tactics they would use is they would find the worst people in these protests, the ones with the most offensive or radical signs, the ones with the worst behavior, and they would just highlight them in order to essentially project onto the entire protest writ large the behavior of the worst people to make it seem, like it was, they were all communist or they were all, anarchist or hating the United States or whatever, just the messages that were designed to make the public turn against it. And I've seen that since, repeatedly. That's a go-to tactic. How much of that is being done here by a media that's obviously antagonistic to their message against vaccine mandates, and how much of this is really representative of the ethos of the movement as a whole?
I think it's important to establish a line of demarcation between the organizers and the protesters. I don't know that it's that important to distinguish a line between the protesters who are there to advocate for themselves and advocate against vaccine mandates, and the malefactors, like the bad actors. Now, granted, at every protest, there are bad actors. Some of them show up as earnestly as possible. They are trying to push their own particular agenda, and that might be to the detriment of the rest of the movement. So, for example, you might see Black Bloc protesters at the G20 protest, or even the Battle of Seattle, etc. And many other protesters believe that they're a detriment to the broader protest movement. Then there's also actual ops, like police, RCMP officers and other police officers that will attend in plainclothes undercover that are trying to agitate. So they show up as agent provocateur. That does happen. That's a tried and true tactic. So I think it is important to note that, yes, these things can happen. On the other hand, It's also a matter of how the rest of the crowd reacts to it. So if somebody shows up engaging in wanton property damage during the course of legitimate protest, generally what will happen is that you'll see people around them like discourage that from happening. They'll like shout at them. They'll say, we don't want you here. In the uprisings in 2020, I even saw people go as far as to like grab people that were engaging in property damage and haul them over for the police to arrest, which I also don't necessarily agree with, but you see how they understand that the optics of it are no good. When people show up in leather jackets bearing the names of neo-Nazi organizations, or when they're literally flying the swastika and nobody else is reacting to it, when pickup trucks are showing up with the Confederate flag flying from the back, which has always struck me as the strangest thing. It's Canadians with Confederate flags, but regardless, when that happens and nobody reacts to it, they act as if this is just legitimate protest. That does pose a little bit of a problem. It's not to say that everybody should be painted with that brush, or that this is what they all believe, that they're all white supremacists. I don't like to do that because I think it's a little bit juvenile myself. On the other hand, you can tell in people's reaction to that whether or not this is something that they care about being seen as being associated with. But I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that matter.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there are significant strains, even if they're minority strains within a protest movement that are non-trivial, that's notable and ought to be reported. If the majority of protesters seem comfortable or at least tolerant of or unbothered by particularly egregious extremist actors, like literal neo-Nazis, that also ought to reflect on the movement. I guess, and since I'm not in Canada, I'm, we're approaching this with humility about the fact that I can't fully know. I guess what I am saying, though, is that particularly when you're looking at a movement that is by its nature anti-establishment, clearly the establishment of Canada is fully behind vaccine mandates, which is why it's the law, and it's a very kind of Canadian thing to do. I don't think there's been a lot of the kind of pushback, even the kind of heterodox anti-establishment pushback we talked about with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK opposing vaccine mandates.
I think there has been pushback up here.
Now, but fair enough. But you would say you even on the left, like it's a kind of left-right anti-establishment pushback.
I will say that I've been rather disappointed with the reactions of the left to this. People who previously thought that the state was a malefactor in all things, or at least that the state can be counted on to act in its own interest, suddenly laid down their skepticism and believe that this is something that we all have to coalesce behind. So, I mean, I personally have not been in favor of mandates or vaccine passports. The Communist Party of Canada has not been in favor of vaccine passports. They have been a bit more, let's say, they haven't come down on one side or the other on mandates. I think they've talked about the necessity of safety measures, i.e. masking and distancing and so on, but they haven't made an outright statement on mandates, although they have talked about the unfairness, the inherent unfairness that is possible if you enforce mandates. But as far as, say, the NDP, the Liberal Party of Canada, the left Liberals, no, they're all marching in lockstep with whatever the federal government tells them to do.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying then is, I mean, regardless of the extent of the opposition, clearly this is a protest against the establishment and an establishment view, which by definition means most media outlets are hostile to the message of the protest and the people behind them. And that makes me very skeptical of how it's being covered, in the sense that this tactic of being able to inflate or exaggerate the influence of the worst elements is a one that is so, I would say it's the most frequently relied upon tactic to disparage protest movements and to get people to turn against them. I mean, it's done all the time. Every left-wing protest in Brazil, the media automatically focuses on this tiny group of protesters called the Black Blocs, which also exists in the West, who believe in violence and they shoot fireworks and sometimes set things on fire, and it turns the public against the protesters, even though even if it's a 0.5% or less of the people participating.